Mark Carney just did something that could reshape North America's economic future, and Washington is watching with alarm. In a move few thought possible, Canada's Prime Minister has opened the door to a deeper partnership with China at the exact moment Donald Trump is trying to weaponize tariffs, squeeze allies, and reassert American dominance. If this deal holds, it won't just hit trade balances. It could hit U.S. leverage, U.S. manufacturing, U.S. pricing power, and the fragile assumption that America still gets to dictate the rules of the global economy. To understand why this matters, you have to understand who Mark Carney is. He is not a provincial politician improvising on the world stage. He is one of the most globally networked economic operators alive today. A man who has run the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, chaired the Financial Stability Board, and worked inside the elite machinery of global finance for decades. Carney has spent his career navigating systemic stress, from the global financial crisis to Brexit-era instability. So when he moves, he does not move like a culture war politician. He moves like a central banker who sees the board 3 moves ahead and understands exactly where the pressure points of the international system really are. That is why this story is so much bigger than Canada. Carney's core idea is brutally simple. If the United States under Trump is becoming more erratic, more coercive, and less predictable, then middle powers can no longer build their economic futures around American goodwill. Reuters reported that Carney explicitly wants Canada to help shape a new global trading order that is less reliant on the United States. He has argued that multilateral institutions are being eroded and that smaller coalitions and plurilateral deals may become the new way countries protect themselves from great power pressure. In plain English, Carney is telling the world that the old U.S.-anchored model is cracking, and countries like Canada need an insurance policy before the next shock hits. Now look at what he actually did in Beijing. During his January 2026 visit, Carney and Xi Jinping launched what Canada's government described as a new strategic partnership focused on energy, agri-food, trade, clean technology, and climate competitiveness. Canada agreed to allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market at the normal most favored nation tariff rate of 6.1%, replacing the previous 100% surtax imposed under Justin Trudeau. In exchange, China moved to slash or suspend major trade barriers on Canadian products, including steep tariff reductions on canola seed and suspensions of anti-discrimination tariffs on canola meal, peas, lobster, and crab. Beijing also resumed access for Canadian beef from registered facilities and reopened channels for other agricultural products. And here is where the narrative gets really dangerous for Washington. This was not a reckless ideological pivot toward Beijing. It was a surgical transaction designed to solve Canadian vulnerabilities. China is Canada's second largest single-country trading partner, and the Canadian government says two-way merchandise trade reached nearly $119 billion in 2024. Ottawa's calculation was cold and strategic. Recover billions in agricultural market access, create space for Chinese clean tech and EV-linked investment, and reduce exposure to a United States that has begun openly threatening tariffs against one of its closest allies. In other words, Carney was not choosing China over America. He was choosing optionality over dependence. But for Donald Trump, optionality is the threat. Because American power in North America has never depended only on military strength. It depends on gravity. The U.S. market is supposed to be so dominant, so indispensable, that neighbors ultimately have no choice but to stay in line. And Canada is still deeply tied to that gravity. Reuters reported that the United States accounted for 68% of Canada's total exports in January 2026, even after that share had fallen from much higher levels. That means Washington still has enormous coercive capacity. But it also means every marginal move by Canada away from the U.S. matters more than headlines suggest, because even a small diversification shift signals something psychologically profound. America's closest economic partners are beginning to prepare for a future in which the U.S. is not a stable center of the system. That is why Trump's reaction was so revealing. At first, Reuters reported that Trump sounded supportive, saying Canada should sign a deal with China if it could get one. But as the political implications became clearer, the tone changed sharply. CBC reported that Trump then threatened a 100% tariff on Canadian goods if Canada makes a deal with China, while his Treasury Secretary tried to narrow the threat by tying it specifically to a full free trade agreement or to Canada becoming a conduit for dumped Chinese goods. Carney publicly responded that Canada has no intention of pursuing a full free trade agreement with China, in part because of Canada's commitments under CUSMA. But that distinction may not calm Washington, because the substance of the shift is already underway. And that is the twist most people are missing. This may be more destabilizing than a formal free trade agreement. A giant treaty would trigger immediate legal alarms, public backlash, and possibly coordinated U.S. retaliation. But a series of narrower, targeted, commercially attractive arrangements can move faster, provoke less resistance, and gradually build a new architecture before Washington fully mobilizes against it. Chinese EV access, agricultural tariff relief, energy cooperation, clean tech investment, financial dialogue, law enforcement cooperation, visa access. Sector by sector, relationship by relationship, a framework emerges. And by the time everyone calls it a strategic realignment, much of it is already embedded. This is also a win for China that goes far beyond canola and electric cars. Beijing has been trying for years to present itself as a more stable economic partner than Washington, especially as U.S. trade policy becomes more punitive and transactional. Reuters noted that China has sought to use Western frustration with Trump's policies to position itself as a reliable alternative. And in early 2026, China's economic hand appeared to be strengthening, with a trade surplus above $1 trillion in 2025, export momentum holding up outside the U.S., and energy stockpiles that gave Beijing resilience during geopolitical stress. China does not need to replace the United States overnight. It only needs to convince enough countries that alignment with China is useful, manageable, and increasingly necessary. And remember, trade is only one layer of this story. Energy is the deeper layer. In Beijing, Carney signaled that Canada was looking to expand cooperation with China in energy: oil, gas, batteries, solar, wind, and energy storage. Reuters reported that Carney said Canada is scaling up LNG exports to Asia and aims to produce 50 million tons of LNG a year by 2030, all destined for Asian markets. That matters because energy routes shape long-term alliances. If Canadian resource flows, Chinese capital, and Asian demand begin to align more tightly, the geopolitical effect is bigger than any single tariff adjustment. It starts to redraw the map of who depends on whom. And then comes the turning point. On March 1, the deal stopped being a diplomatic headline and started becoming a market reality. China suspended anti-discrimination tariffs on Canadian canola meal, peas, lobster, and crab through the end of 2026, while Canada implemented its initial quota for Chinese EVs at the 6.1% tariff rate. Canada later confirmed that China had reduced tariffs on Canadian canola seed to 14.9%, down from nearly 85%. This is the moment the entire situation became more serious, because once cargoes move, once buyers sign, once manufacturers price around new rules, politics becomes harder to reverse. Rhetoric is reversible, supply chains are not. That is the nightmare scenario for Trump's economic strategy. Tariffs are supposed to isolate rivals and discipline allies, but when overused, they can do the opposite. They force allies to search for backups. They create workarounds. They accelerate the very diversification they were meant to prevent. If Canada, one of America's most integrated economic partners, starts building credible commercial alternatives with China, then every other U.S. ally hears the same message. Japan hears it. South Korea hears it. Europe hears it. The Gulf hears it. Even if they do not follow Canada immediately, they begin gaming out how to survive in a world where Washington uses access as a threat. That erodes American leverage long before trade volumes fully shift. There is also a direct U.S. economic angle here that will hit home with ordinary viewers. If Chinese EVs gain a deeper foothold in Canada while Chinese industrial machinery and components continue moving into North American supply networks through legal channels, Pressure builds on U.S. manufacturers to respond on cost, speed, and pricing. If Washington retaliates by hitting Canadian goods, the blowback does not stop at the border. It can raise costs for U.S. consumers, disrupt integrated auto and parts supply chains, and inject fresh uncertainty into sectors already exposed to tariff fatigue. The North American economy is too interwoven for the U.S. to punish Canada cleanly. When you throw a rock at that supply chain, the glass breaks on both sides. But the strategic battle goes deeper still, into finance and currency influence. No, the Chinese yuan is not replacing the U.S. dollar tomorrow. SWIFT data still shows the renminbi ranked only 6th in global payments by value, with a 2.88% share in mid-2025. But that misses the point. Geopolitical finance does not change all at once. It changes through marginal normalization. More bilateral trade settled outside the dollar, more financial dialogue, more investment channels, more countries willing to treat Beijing as a parallel financial pole rather than just a manufacturing hub. That is how currency influence expands, not through one dramatic overthrow, but through 1,000 decisions made in boardrooms, ministries, and commodity markets under stress. What makes this so combustible is that both sides think they are playing defense. Canada says it is diversifying because it has to. China says it is opening because the U.S. is trying to contain it. Trump says he is threatening tariffs because allies are weakening America's position. But when every major actor believes it is acting defensively, the system becomes more dangerous, not less. Defensive moves stack on top of each other until they look, feel, and function like escalation. That is when markets lurch, alliances strain, and ordinary businesses suddenly realize the rules they planned around no longer exist. You can call that trade policy. In reality, it is economic warfare with a friendlier vocabulary. Now let's talk predictions, because this is where the story turns from dramatic to potentially historic. Over the next 6 months, the most likely development is not a spectacular rupture, but a quiet deepening. More Canadian sectors will push for restored Chinese access. More Chinese firms will probe Canadian clean tech, battery, metals, and logistics opportunities. Washington will increase pressure ahead of major North American trade reviews, and Trump will keep the tariff threat alive because the threat itself is a negotiating weapon. The market impact may begin as sector-specific volatility, especially in autos, agriculture, industrial inputs, and companies with cross-border exposure. Over the next 1 to 2 years, the real question is whether Canada can convert tactical diversification into structural diversification. Reuters quoted experts saying that for Canada to reduce its merchandise exports to the U.S. by just 10%, it would need an enormous expansion of sales elsewhere, including to China and several other major economies. That tells you how hard this will be. Canada cannot replace the U.S. market, but it may not need to. If it can create enough alternatives to reduce vulnerability, then American coercive power weakens at the margin, and margins matter in geopolitics. Once a country proves it can survive some pain, threats lose some of their terror. Over the next 3 to 5 years, the stakes become much bigger. If Canada succeeds even partially, we could see a more fragmented Western economic sphere, where U.S. allies remain militarily close to Washington, but commercially far more flexible with Beijing. That would be a profound shift from the old assumption that security alignment automatically dictated economic alignment. It would also mean that future American presidents inherit a world where allies hedge more aggressively, China is harder to isolate, and trade disputes spill faster into energy, technology, food security, and finance. The system would be less unified, less efficient, and much harder for any one capital to dominate. And for everyday people, this is not abstract. If this standoff intensifies, Americans could face higher prices on vehicles, components, and consumer goods tied to North American and Asian supply chains. Canadians could face fierce domestic political battles over jobs, industry protection, and whether Chinese capital is a lifeline or a Trojan horse. Farmers may gain market access while auto workers fear undercutting. Investors may chase opportunity while governments worry about dependency. That is what makes this story so explosive. In a single move, Carney may have boosted Canadian leverage, strengthened China's narrative, and expose just how brittle the U.S.-led economic order has become. So here is the question that should keep Washington awake tonight. What if the real threat to American power is not a direct confrontation with China, but the slow realization by allies that they can no longer afford to depend on the United States alone? Because if that idea takes hold, then this is not just a Canada story, or a China story, or a Trump story. It is the beginning of a new age of strategic hedging, where countries smile in public, sign security communiques, and then quietly build escape routes underneath the old order. And if that is what Mark Carney has just begun, then the biggest economic blow to Trump may not be the deal itself, it may be the precedent.